Okay.
Well, thank you, Dr. Zaman, for giving me the floor. Respected guests, speakers, colleagues, presenters, participants, and students, welcome back. I am Saranjan Barry, a lecturer at the Department of English and Humanities at ULAB, and we will now begin our final plenary session of this conclave. Please join me in welcoming our speakers for this session, Dr. Christin Höne of Maastricht University, who will speak on Jagadish Chandra Bose and the anti-colonial politics of science fiction, and Dr. Avishek Parui from the Indian Institute of Technology, Madras, whose talk is titled On Culture and the Literary. The chair for this session is Dr. Tabassum Zaman, Associate Professor at the Department of English and Humanities, ULAB. May I please request Dr. Zaman to introduce our speakers now and to begin the plenary session.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello again. Sorry about that. All right, so I'll just quickly start the proceedings. We have two very distinguished guests with us, speakers with us, and I will introduce them in due course. Let me start off with our first up is Dr. Christin Höne from, she's an assistant professor in literary studies at Maastricht University. Her research, she has a very versatile research interest. Her body of research spans post-colonial literature, very interestingly, sound studies and word and music studies, and also queer theory. Today, her paper is titled Jagadish Chandra Bose and Anti-Colonial Politics of Science Fiction. I will hand the floor over to her. Just a few things. You'll have 20 minutes, and then for each speaker, we have 20 minutes, and we will have question and answer session towards the end of the session. So for all the audience, if you have any questions, please either you can write it in the chat box or you can ask it yourself towards the end of the session. Christine, over to you.
Thank you so much, Tabassum, for this kind introduction, and thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and I don't just mean MyEthic in Maastricht, I mean at the conference, if only virtually. I'm going to dive right in, and I'm looking forward to questions afterwards. So I'm going to talk about Jagadish Chandra Bose and the anti-colonial politics of science fiction. Now, just a couple of words of introduction. I'm sure I don't really need them. Bose was born in 1858 in the Bengal presidency of what was then colonized India, and he died there 79 years later in 1937. Educated in colonial Kolkata and in England, Bose became the first Indian to become professor in physics at Presidency College in Kolkata in the late 1880s. He was an internationally renowned scientist, public intellectual, and a polymath who was throughout his life mostly known for his work as a physicist and his research in electromagnetic waves, until his contributions in that field were quite curiously forgotten, both during his lifetime and then throughout the 20th century. When he became known instead for his work on the physiology of plants. There's a whole different talk and conversation to be had about that shift in career. Unfortunately, we won't really have the time to go into this today. He was also the president of the Academy of Bengali Literature for several years, and in 1896, he wrote what is considered to be one of the first Bengali science fiction stories, and this is going to be the focus of my talk today. Runaway Cyclone, as it was translated in 2012, was first published in 1896 and republished in an extended version by the author in 1921. What interests me in particular about this really quite short story is how Bose combines elements of science fiction and magical realism, and how he turns the narrative tropes of Western science fiction on their head, and thus undermines Western science as an epistemological tool of imperial control. So Bose wrote Niru de Shakaini, the story of the missing one, as an entry for a short story competition that was organized somewhat peculiar by an Indian hair oil company in 1896. Now, this was a publicity stunt for that hair oil company, and the condition for all entries of short stories was that the stories had to make reference to the company's most prominent product, which is Kuntal Keshari, which was named Kuntalin in the 1896 version of Bose's story. So Bose features Kuntal Keshari prominently in the story. It becomes the deus as an ex machina that ends up saving Kolkata. from an approaching cyclone. And Bose ended up winning that story. It was conceived of that story as a bit of a joke, but he ended up winning anyway. And 25 years later, in 1921, he published an expanded version under the new title, which was Politik de France. And in 2012, 2013, the story was finally translated into English by Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay as Runaway Cyclone and published in an online magazine, Strange Horizons. And this is the version that I'll be working with. Unfortunately, I neither speak nor read Bangla, so I'm working with the English translation. And this already brings up a lot of questions and debates around the language of the story, both then and today, and the importance of language, of course, in the context of nation building, which is, of course, one of the main themes of the conclave. And I'm really looking forward to these discussions later. Because also back then, one of the main differences between the 1896 version of the story and the 1921 version of the story was that in the earlier version, Bose included some passages in English, whereas the 1921 version ended up written completely in Bangla. And by then, for Bose, that was a political choice. It's important that we consider this change in language in the context, of course, of the politics of the time. So between 1896 and 1921, what we see in 1905 is, of course, the partition of Bengal. In the 1920s, anti-colonial sentiments throughout colonized India are running really high. And so the nationalist force and the charge of that story become even more apparent in the later version of it. And so what initially started out as a joke about a hair oil as a national symbol becomes really, in that later version of the story, a political argument in support of the nationalist movement. To tell you a bit more about this story. So it's about a cyclone that threatens Calcutta. Newspapers warn of the impending catastrophe, citing the latest readings by the meteorological department. But on the appointed day, the cyclone fails to appear, much to the astonishment of the newspapers, much to the astonishment of the meteorological department and the Western scientists. It is only in the second part of the story that a mystery is lifted by a personal account of a balding man, and this is quite crucial, who was on a ship in the middle of the cyclone shortly before it makes landfall. Thinking that his last moment has come, he remembers that his daughter has packed him a bottle of Kuntal Kashari. He also remembers a scientific article that he recently read that describes how a film of oil on water calms the surface of that water. So the man throws the bottle of hair oil overboard, which immediately calms the waters, and the cyclone disappears and disaster is avoided. So several things are remarkable about this story when we look at it as a work of science fiction on the one hand and as a work of colonial literature on the other. The story consists of two parts. Part one mainly charts the arrival and the sudden disappearance of the cyclone as described through the lens of Western scientists and English newspaper articles. By the way, I sometimes have problems with the internet, so if I cut off in between, please just let me know by one way or another. Everyone's equally puzzled, and in part two, we learn about the real cause of the cyclone's disappearance, which is the bottle of hair oil. What is striking is that this resolution seems scientifically sound and completely improbable at the same time. One single bottle of hair oil to calm a cyclone, but after all, the protagonist had just read about the effects of oil on water in a scientific journal. So this adds a supernatural dimension to the scientific one. The 1921 version adds another layer of the supernatural, which is the origin story of that hair oil, which is not included in the earlier version. And that origin story goes as follows. An English circus director one day traveled to India, but upon his arrival, his lion, the star of his show, lost his mane due to seasickness. In dire straits, the man prays at the feet of a sannyasa who in turn offers him a bottle of that hair oil and says that the formula came to him in a dream. So the hair oil cures the lion and makes its mane grow back within the week. And this origin story complicates our reading of Runaway Cyclone as a work of science fiction because it does not add to the scientific element of the story. The origin story further mystifies the hair oil and renders Runaway Cyclone a peculiar hybrid of science fiction and magical realism. The science fictional elements include the cyclone, so the natural phenomenon, expert meteorologists and the chemical effects of oil on water. The magical realist elements include the circus, the bold lion, and the circus director praying at the feet of a sannyasi, who in turn offers him a hair oil whose formula came to him in a dream. The 1921 version integrates both elements, which become mutually dependent rather than mutually exclusive. So the Western scientists quoted in the story fail in their ability to account for the cyclone's sudden disappearance, and the failure is one of the imagination. As far as they know, there simply cannot be a rational explanation for the phenomenon, and strictly speaking, within the story, there is none. The properties of the hair oil are as much scientific in their effect as they are supernatural in their origin. And the Western scientists' narrow view thus hinders them from seeing the bigger picture. So I suggest that we can read this indictment of Western science on two levels, on the personal level and the political. On the personal level, Bose was very self-conscious of his position as an Indian scientist working across disciplines at a time when neither interdisciplinarity nor scientists from India were highly regarded in the West. Throughout his life, Bose had to battle the colonial prejudice that Indians were inept at the natural sciences because of their predisposition towards the metaphysical. Bose writes about this, Tagore writes about this, Gaddis writing about Bose writes about this. So Bose proved the prejudice wrong by sheer success. But on a political level, we can read Runaway Cyclone as a critique of Western science as one of the founding epistemologies of imperialism. So to go into this a bit more in detail, a couple of critics have looked at kind of the politics of science fiction in the context of post-colonial theory. John Reeder is one of them, and in his book, Colonialism and the Emergence of Science Fiction, he argues that, quote, colonialism is a significant historical context of early science fiction. This, end of quote, this holds not only because the rise of the genre in the West coincided with the period of high European imperialism, but also because the stories directly engage colonialism on the content level. Patricia Kaslak, in her book, Science Fiction and Empire, similarly defines, quote, the function and manipulation of political power, of empire, and its abuses within the genre as one of the most important and revealing foundations of science fiction, end of quote. A couple of major tropes of science fiction as they relate to empire include the themes of empire, power, and imperialism, the figure of the other, and the notions of center and periphery. Hoagland and Sarwell, to other critics in their introduction to the edited collection Science Fiction, Imperialism, and the Third World, define imperialism as, quote, one of science fiction's most dominant definitional markers. And they outline 4 aspects that link science fiction with imperialism, and I'm going to go into detail on 2 of them. So first, science fiction's relationship to history. Second, the self-other dichotomy that is central to both science fiction and the discourse of imperialism. Third, the master narratives of science fiction film, so the explorative, the domesticative, and the combative. And fourth, science fiction's emphasis on social and ethical issues. The first 2 are of importance for me today. So as to science fiction's relation to history, Runaway Cyclone is firmly situated within the context of colonial Calcutta. But instead of telling the story from the perspective of the colonizer, the story's narrator is a local Bengali man. Thus, Bose turns the colonial dichotomy of self versus other on its head, as it is the Western characters that are rendered marginal, other, and mere caricatures of the typical hero figures of Western science fiction. I'm going to come back to that in a bit, talking about the circus director and the German scientist in particular. So the master narrative of exploration is thereby equally inverted. The story features an English circus director and a German scientist who embody the genre-typical figures of the would-be explorer and the would-be discoverer. However, both fail in their respective quests to invade and explain. So to explain this in a bit more detail, both the circus director and the scientist are modeled on the stereotypical hero of Western science fiction who sets out to conquer a strange land in his, and it is almost exclusively always his, quest for either adventure, which is the circus director, and Bose's story, or knowledge, which is the scientist. So this strange land is typically either empty or inhabited by equally strange creatures in science fiction that present more or less trying obstacles for the hero to overcome. which he manages to do to his superior science fiction due to his superior scientific knowledge and all technological prowess. So far, so true. So the narrative tropes of the stranger and the strange land are so pervasive in science fiction that Jessica Langer calls them the central myths of the genre. And Langer elaborates further that, quote, the figure of the alien, extraterrestrial, technological, human hybrid or otherwise, and the figure of the faraway planet ripe for the taking are deep and abiding twin signifiers in science fiction. And she goes on to argue that they are the same deep and abiding twin signifiers in colonialism, in and of colonialism. So in Runaway Cyclone, Bose takes the narrative tropes of the stranger and the strange land and turns them on their heads. By starting out in the supposedly strange land, the land is immediately appropriated by the narrative voice, which is revealed to be that of a local man. There is no Western hero who comes, saves, and conquers. Instead, it is an Indian man who saves the day by throwing a bottle of Indian hair oil overboard an Indian ship. Bose therefore turns the would-be stranger into the hero and the would-be vessel of conquest, of colonial conquest, the ship, into the indigenous vessel of salvation. Moreover, the would-be discoverer, the English circus director, and the German scientist are mere cartoon versions of their mythical selves as heroes of Western science fiction, as both of them fail in their project of cultural and scientific imperialism. Arriving in India, the circus director's star of the show, his lion, loses his mane and now resembles, in the English translation of Bose's story, a hairless street dog. And the German scientist, in an article seeking to explain the disappearance of the cyclone, talks about anything but the disappearance of that cyclone and fails to know, let alone explain, the truth of what happened. Bose thus deftly undermines the twin myth of science fiction and colonialism and appropriates it for the purpose of promoting an Indian philosophy of science that integrates both knowledge and the imagination, the scientific and the spiritual. There's another talk altogether about Bose's philosophy of science, which he doesn't only outline in the short story, but also in many of his speeches that he's given throughout his life, particularly at universities, but that would be for a different day. So as to the particular role of science in science fiction and how scientific knowledge relates to the discursive tropes of imperialism, Reader argues that Western colonial science fiction, quote, articulates the distribution of knowledge and power at a certain moment of colonialism's history, end of quote. And it is the epistemology of Western knowledge as one of the foundations of Western colonial power that Bose challenges in Runaway Cyclone. It's not only the German scientist who fails in his quest to explain the disappeared cyclone, it is also the colonial scientific institutions and Western science as a whole that fail in their epistemological project to make sense of what Bose at the outset of the story describes as a supernatural event. So the story states that, quote, a number of articles were published in various scientific journals to explain the phenomenon, but till now no explanation of the event has been found satisfactory, and thus the event rocked the scientific communities of America and Europe, end of quote. The meteorological department, which of course is a colonial institution, is equally at a loss to explain what happened. And the colonial government finds itself under immense public pressure to justify, quote, new equipment worth over 1 lakh rupees that had been purchased for the meteorological department, end of quote. However, it later turns out that the equipment itself was not faulty after all the cyclone really did occur. It just could not account for the extreme weather event's sudden disappearance. So in the end, and with that I'm going to close, it is indigenous knowledge that saves the day, while Western knowledge and colonial scientific institutions are shown to be and helpless in trying to make sense of and providing a solution for the problem at hand. So this undermines the master tropes of technological unevenness, quote from Reader, the master trope of technological unevenness, a myth that supposedly justifies oppression of the supposedly technological inferior other in both science fiction and colonial discourse. The Runaway Cyclone as a story thus subverts the epistemology of Western science as an instrument of imperialism. And of course, writing in his native Bangla, Bose does therefore not only subvert the language of science, but also the language of the colonizer. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Christine. I think that was a wonderful, wonderful reading of the short story. I'm sure the audience will have a lot of questions for you towards the end. We will now move to our second speaker for today, who is Dr. Avishek Parui from Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. And his talk is titled On Culture and the Literary. He has a very, wonderful profile of research, as I can see. He's a fellow, also an associate fellow of the UK Higher Education Academy. He is the author of Postmodern Literatures and also Culture and the Literary Matter, Metaphor and Memory. He's also the principal investigator at the Center for Memory Studies at IIT Madras. I now welcome Dr. Parui to deliver his talk. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much for the very kind introduction. I hope I'm audible. I hope you can all hear me correctly. Yeah. So thank you very much for the wonderful introduction and for the great invitation. It's an absolute honor to be part of this wonderful conclave. And thanks to the speaker as well, Christine. I think I've managed to listen to most part of it. I think it was absolutely fascinating. So my very brief talk, I mean, it's just more of a pitch really rather than a full-fledged talk. I do apologize. I don't really have a full paper, but I'm just going to pitch a few ideas which will hopefully be relevant to the scope and content of this conclave. So as was pointed out during the very kind introduction, that the title of this session is Culture and the Literary. So what I'm really interested in, and this is part of my research as well, is to look at the medium of literature, the medium of the literary medium, as it were, and to what extent is it important for cultural studies and also for memory, because I think this conclave is so wonderfully conceived. I think it draws on Bakhtin. There is this dialogic imagination quality about it, but it also talks about different forms of nationalism, national memory. So I think it's a very complex topic. So let's start with Bakhtin for a bit, and then I'll move on and connect it to the other philosophical terms that I do espouse in my book. So I think a very interesting and sometimes a bit understudied concept of Bakhtin is a chronotop. And it emerges from a literary concept. I mean, those of us who read the Dialogic Imagination would know he talks about Dostoevsky and the way Moscow and St. Petersburg, the cities appear as chronotops. But we also do know that that's a concept which has been borrowed heavily in anthropological studies as well. And I'm particularly interested, in the idea of the chronotopic lamination, right? So how do you laminate space and time? And that's something which you see increasingly of interest in anthropology and cultural studies. But be that as it may, so let's just go back to the literary origins of the chronotop and to what extent is it important for us, those of us who are interested to study literature as a tool, as a medium, because I think literature as a concept, and I was listening to the earlier speaker as well in terms of short stories of J.C. Bose, which is absolutely fascinating. The whole medium of literature is a medium of possibilities. So I define literature as a production of possibilities. It's a very unique ontological scale, a very ontological medium through which possibilities can be generated. And the reason why it's interesting politically is because I think it has this unique ability to combine reality and possibility. So in other words, if you take a look at something like historical fiction, fiction based on historical reality, but obviously digressing from it, taking creative liberties from it. One of the very important things, one of the most immediate things that it does is that it tells you about what really happened and it combines that with what could have happened, right? And sometimes it makes it even more complex by adding the element of what should have happened, right? So we have what really happened with what could have happened and with what should have happened. Now, in doing so, literature, I argue, has a unique ability to articulate absence, right? The silences in history, the silences in any nationalist imagination, the ellipses, the aporia, as it were, of any historical dominant discourse of knowledge, history, etc. So literature is, I argue, is an interstitial medium, is a medium which engages with possibilities, engages and articulates ambivalence. It is something which forces us to read between the lines, and in doing so, it produces plural possibilities through which history, memory, knowledge, the entire epistemological narrative can be revisited. Now, in my book, which has just been recently published by Roman Littlefield, Culture and the Literary, I do exactly this. And I think a conclave like this is so fascinating because it looks at literature very seriously, not just as a political tool of representation, but also an affective tool of representation. And this is, I think, which really makes it interesting and very radical. And I do congratulate the thinkers who came together for this conference, because I think the affective quality of literature is sometimes thought of as apolitical. We tend to see it as something outside the political parameters. But I argue that it's exactly the opposite, that the affective is the political, right? And the reason why literature can move us emotionally and sometimes subversively is precisely because it's something like an affect machine. It can produce affect in a way which very few other mediums can, right? And it has this unique ability to reconfigure language. Now, I'm not going to go too far into the language bit of literature, but I do know through different kinds of discourses that one of the things that literature does quite well is that it produces defamiliarization. And that's something which we know through the Russian formalists, Victor Shklovsky, etc. I'm not going to go too far into it, but suffice it to say that that ability to produce defamiliarization or that ability to produce strangeness through affect is exactly what makes literature political and effective. And I'm looking at these two categories as connected categories, as ontologically and functionally connected categories. I mean, literature is political because it is effective, right? And the affect and the political are connected together all the time. So, I mean, even as something as quote unquote apolitical, like the lyric, can be profoundly political, precisely because it can move the readers emotionally, subversively, radically, etc. And now, one of the things that immediately comes to mind, especially if you look at a conference like this, is how do metaphors fit in the scheme of things? Because, you know, the moment we start talking about literature and the literary medium and the literary landscape, we are in the domain of the figurative, as it were. We are in the domain of the metaphors, the similes, the synecdoches, the metonymic, etc. In other words, we are always already in the domain of the defamiliarized. Literature does that quite well. It defamiliarizes language. It produces possibilities through this very effective linguistic defamiliarization. So be that as it may, how do you locate something like metaphors in the scheme of things? And to what extent can metaphors be political in quality? Now, I think we can safely say that a large part of political imagination in almost any country in the world, in any nation in the world, relies on metaphors, relies on producing metaphors. Now, it's important for us to define metaphors a little bit. And one of the philosophers that I draw on personally in the definition of metaphors is Hugo Drijsma, the Dutch philosopher who has a wonderful book on Metaphors of Memory. I think it's a fascinating work. Now, the metaphor, by very definition, is a semantically condensed form of knowledge. You condense certain bits together, and it produces a sign, a symbol. But the fundamental thing about a metaphor is that it can tell something and mean something different from what it really is. I mean, it can have a literal objective meaning at a very semantic, straightforward, superficially semantic level. But at the same time, it can have a forward-looking quality through which different meanings can be produced out of it. So, you know, the metaphor of a lion can be different in different countries, etc. Now, a large part of national imaginaries across all, I mean, I think this is something which is common across all nations in the world, will rely on metaphors of memory. And again, so we can see how even in the way that political nationalist discourses are orchestrated, symphonized, constructed, there is always already a degree of metaphoricity in those, in terms of how metaphors are brought together, and that produces different subliminals, plural, and very complex structures of knowledge through which things are remembered. Now, one of the things that we are very interested in our research in the Center for Memory Studies is to also look at, when we look at remembering and memory, also looking at forgetting as a phenomenon, as a very complex political affective phenomenon. And we all know now through different research in neuroscience as well as in political theory that forgetting is almost always, it's never really an innocent activity. Forgetting reveals bias. Even the most hardcore empirical brain-based model of forgetting, you forget something because the brain wants to get rid of it, and it wants a certain kind of privileged memory out of which It prunes out the less privileged ones. Now, the same model of privileged remembering, biased remembering, in terms of how certain things are remembered and certain things are unremembered, gets replicated even at a more collective level. Let's say national memory, historical memory, collective memory, etc. So even in terms of looking at collective history and collective memory, cultural memory, and this is again something which is almost constant across all countries in the world, there are certain events, there are certain figures, there are certain phenomena which must be forgotten for the memory to be sustainable. So in other words, for any memory model to be operative, ontologically operative, or functionally operative, it must also be able to produce forgetting, right? It must be also able to produce silences, produce absences. So what we see immediately is that we are looking at forgetting not as an act of passive absorption through which certain things are forgotten, but also as an act of manipulation, and as an act of production through which certain things are produced. Forgetting as an act of production, collective amnesia. You produce amnesia, you produce forgetting by not talking about certain things, by superimposing certain other forms of knowledge and memory on certain things which you want to disappear. Now, this again is something which literature does very well in terms of looking at different focal points of remembering and forgetting. Because one of the first things which we learn as students of literature is the whole business of focalization. Who is doing the storytelling? Who is doing the remembering? What is the focal point through which a story is being told, right? And that awareness of focalization, that awareness of that, shall we say, for want of a better word, that consciousness location is very important in literature. What is a consciousness through which a story is unfolded? That storytelling location, right? Now, that awareness of focalization through which we know that the same story can be told from different positions, and every position will have its own unique biases, that trains us in a certain sense to treat forgetting seriously, to look at absences seriously, to pay equal attention, sometimes perhaps more attention, to what is not being said, rather than just focusing on what is being said, to read between the lines, to be competent readers. But I think this whole idea of competent reading, through which we have this ability to read between the lines, this ability to know that no meaning is ever exhausted, that there is this inexhaustible quality about meanings, through which the same event can be read in different ways, and different meanings can be teased out because of those readings. That is very, very applicable in a way one can be trained to look at collective memories and cultural memories. And again, I'm so fascinated by this conclave, because when I was going through the description of this conclave, the philosophy which has been espoused, I think equal attention has been paid to misrepresentations rather than just looking at representation. So what are the representations which have been misrepresented? And if we push it further, just one notch further up, we can also argue what are the missed representations, representations which are not done, right? Things which are forgotten, things which are unremembered, shall we say, right? So I think this whole business of memory should be seen as an entanglement of remembering and forgetting, because even at the most molecular level, the molecular mechanism of memory, it operates through three stages, fundamentally speaking: encoding, consolidation, and retrieval. Something has to be encoded into a pattern. You can call it engram, you can call it any scientific term, but there has to be a pattern through which an event must be encoded in the brain. Now that must be consolidated, and then lastly, it must be retrieved. Now the same model is operative even at a cultural, more shared level. An event, a knowledge, a political phenomena, whatever the case may be, must be encoded in collective memory. Now that encoding can take place through museums, that encoding can take place through pamphlets, that encoding can take place through any kinds of architecture of memory one can think of. But we also know, those of us who study literature, that every act of encoding, it entails inclusion and exclusion. Certain things must be left outside of the encoding paradigm, and certain things must not be consolidated, and certain things must not be retrieved. So there is always an absence, which is forgetting. So remembering and forgetting should not be seen as ontological opposites, but should be seen rather as cognitively connected categories at a molecular level as well as at a shared cultural level. And lastly, I'm just going to finish with this now. We also know, those of us who are students in memory studies, that in looking at memory, it's not just enough to say memory is looking back at the past and it's trying to sort of look at the past, revisit the past. Now that element of revisiting the past sometimes has a different kind of intentionality. That revisiting the past can also be done in a way to shape the future. the way in which the past is revisited can also be used in a way the future can be envisioned, the future can be constructed. So there is this futuristic quality of memory as well, this bidirectional quality of memory as well. You look back at something, you're nostalgic about something, well, that element of nostalgia, that effect of nostalgia, shall we say, is also useful in the way you aspire the future to become. And we see that those examples abundantly in migration studies, exile studies, literature about those, those tragedies, those human situations, where the past is used, where the past is revisited, not so much as a lazy nostalgic thing, but also as a way, as a template through which the future must maybe envisioned, through which the future may be sort of created and constructed in the mind, politically as well as effectively. And literature, lastly, literature as a medium, as an ontological fluid framework, is also able, uniquely, I argue, to have this bidirectional quality through which the nostalgic, the retrospective, and the futuristic, the retrospective and the prospective can be balanced together in a way that there's always a forward-looking quality about literature. And that can manifest itself through open-ended readings, through which the novels never really end, but can sort of keep going on forever. And every reading is a generation of a new meaning, but also, more fundamentally, in the very basic and fundamental slipperiness of language that literature produces, where language always slips into something prospective, right? And that production of this prospective quality the literature does, even the most banal classic realist novels would do that, and also the more experimental novels and poetry can do that as well. That also has an aspirational quality, utopian/dystopian quality, through which the past can be remembered, and the future can also be sort of imagined ahead. In a certain sense. So I think that's why, and this is just a very basic summary, of course, but I think hopefully these are some of the reasons which are hopefully pressing that we need to take a look at literature as an affective medium and a political medium and a very unique ontological medium through which collective memory, history can be reread and revisited. And perhaps that kind of a reading will help us know more to situate ourselves as subjects in this moving medium of history and knowledge production. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. All right, so the floor is open for questions now. So if you can ask your own question or you can type it in the chat box. I think we already have one. Can you see the question? Because our speakers? Unfortunately, I think it's the phone's name. I don't have the person's name. So if you could just ask it yourself, the question.
Yeah, I think the question is for Dr. Avishek. Yeah, about the focalization. So
Yeah.
I'm happy to take,
Can you see that?
Yeah, can I answer that?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Can focalization be supportive to the writers of stream of consciousness? Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of cognitive interest suddenly on stream of consciousness. A lot of scientists are looking at it, and I'm thinking of someone like Antonio Damasio, V.S. Ramachandran, Joseph Ledoux, Eric Kandel. You find all these scientists who are like really hardcore neuroscientists are suddenly very interested in literature and the affective language. And I think there's a lot of interest, perhaps a little biased interest, on modernism. Prose is a big thing. I mean, prose is like a poster boy in memory studies. Every scientist has read prose now. But I think there's a lot of validity in a stream of consciousness, because what happens in a stream of consciousness is that there's an added dimensionality of space-time which opens up. I mean, those of us who read Joyce would know, and this is why Bakhtin is so important, and that's why I think it's such a brilliantly conceived conclave that you join on Bakhtin so uniquely. Because the whole idea of the unique chronotop, the whole idea of the experiential chronotop through which the subject travels into a chronotop is almost like a rabbit hole that you go into a way disconnected from the historical, political, claustrophobic conditions. And I'm thinking of Joyce and Dublin in particular. And that liberation into that chronotop is exactly what the stream of consciousness does. And I think it is an example, I think, of hyperfocalization, where the subject travels into the subject. And I'm thinking of someone like Yeats, who has this brilliant poem called Vacillations. And those of you who read it would know, the setting is London, and he's about to celebrate his 50th birthday. And he's in a cafe in London, and the lines go something like that. For 20 minutes, more or less, such was my happiness that I was blessed and could bless. right? So amidst the dim of London, the traffic of London, suddenly the subject disappears into a private chronotop. And that is hyper-focalization, I think. And there's a lot of scientific interest on stream of consciousness as well. And I think it's amazing how those writers got there. I mean, I would like to believe that they got there before the scientists did. So the scientists are sort of catching up on that. There is something called a neuro novel today. So people like Ian McEwan are writing this Joyce and one-day novels, like let's say Saturday, and even Ishiguro is interested in that kind of writing as well. Murakami is full of examples of streams of consciousness. So yeah, my very, very affirmative response would be a very strong yes. But I would argue it's an example of hyper-focalization through which the subject disappears into the subject, not just distributed, but inside.
I think you have another question, Dr. Parui.
Yeah, this is from Tausif, if I may.
Dr. Tausif Usman.
Yes, how effective is a metaphor of the palimpsest in thinking of cultural memory as represented by? Yeah, it's a fascinating metaphor about a metaphor, I think, that you just supplied me. I must steal that from you in my next talk. The metaphor of the palimpsest, because the whole idea of the palimpsest is a layered structure, right? The other thing about the palimpsest is there's no really hierarchy in the palimpsest. Every layer is connected to every other layer. And I think I'm also thinking, thanks to your brilliant observation, I'm also thinking of the rhizome in the way that people like Guattari have theorized it. The rhizome as a metaphor, something that connects as well as disconnects, something that's centripetal as well as centrifugal. I think I'm just showing off my class 10 physics. Things get in and things go out, and that happens almost simultaneously. So I think the idea of the palimpsest is really interesting, and the metaphor of the palimpsest in terms of looking at culture as a layered understanding of knowledge. And I think that's a very useful metaphor, even very objectively, because it helps us understand how certain orders of culture become dominant over certain other layers of culture, and how that the whole production of the dominant culture is mutable, but at the same time, it is quite material as well as affective. Because for a culture to become dominant over other cultures, there must be material investments, and there also should be affective investments. And again, I'm looking at material and affective as connected categories. So that would be my response to your really interesting question.
Thank you. So if anybody else has any other questions, Shamshad, sir, you have your hands up, so please go ahead.
Yeah, brilliant session. Loved it, every second of it. And yeah, we talked about the trap of the symbolic and the figuration. My question is actually to Dr. Christin Höne. I'm just curious, how do you read the magic realistic element, in the science fiction that you have just read, and especially throwing that bottle of hair oil to diffuse the tidal force. So do you think there is a sense of mockery, irony, however you put it, and how does it present you're talking about the the post-colonial aspect to it. And when you think of Great India Society, Tagore and others, when they were talking about two types of science available, the Western science, so being very aggressive, violent, and almost a destructive force to civilization. And then you need a science that is full of affective quality, empathetic quality, and all that. So a science that is pro human, and the other is anti-human. And now you have a remedy, which is, ironically, the name of the company that was sponsoring the, the science fiction story collection. So these Kuntalini, the Keshari, and the brand that Bosch was promoting. So do you think there is a kind of a self-defeating ending to the story that you have shared with us?
Thank you so much. I'm going to take the question in two parts. I'm going to answer in two parts as well. So first, on the magical realism, what just struck me reading the story were these different elements. First, that were identifiably science fiction, and the others that I at least identified as magical realism. And what is interesting to me was that these literary genres in and of themselves are usually defined as mutually exclusive. So whereas magical realism is usually defined as not being science fiction simply because the magic that happens isn't reduced to science or isn't explicable in science, but is contained within the real. Science fiction, of course, defies any element of the magical in whatever way, and arguing that the science featured, however outlandish, needs to be in some way or other reducible to scientific principles. And so the two genres are generally defined as mutually exclusive. Bose combines them and makes them mutually dependent in the story. And what I found interesting about that, if you know a bit more about about Bose's own philosophy of science, which is of course heavily influenced by his monistic imaginary of Vedantic Hinduism, so kind of to see the unity in all is something that Bose didn't only believe, but was also his approach to science, kind of an interdisciplinary approach to science, to bridging the different disciplines, which he did in his own life and in his own scientific practice, and which he also talked about and wrote about at length, and which was one of the reasons that he fell out of grace for a couple of decades in the West. Because of that kind of approach to a unified vision of science and bridging different disciplines, which at that time in the West really wasn't the done thing. And your comment about Tagore and Bose, which I take in kind of the more political direction of science and of Indian science as practiced by Bose, that is something that developed over the decades. If we look at Bose's life, he had 4 decades work of being a scientist, and knew both the Indian scientific scene and the Western scientific scenes very well, was an active part in both. And so his own kind of understanding of science in the terms of anti-colonial nationalism developed from the 1890s throughout the early 20th century, throughout the 1920s in particular, and then the 1930s. And there are a couple of quotes from a couple of his speeches that are really interesting, and I wanted to share one with you from his opening speech for the Bose Research Institute, which he opened in 1917, which is of course still up and running in Kolkata. And I think I just wanted to share that bit of the quote for you, because I think it exemplifies Bose's own understanding of science in the context of anti-colonialism quite beautifully in that. Just give me 1 second because I need to find it back. I had it and then I searched for something else. So he says, many a nation had risen in the past and won the empire of the world. Few buried fragments are all that remain as memorials of the great dynasties that wielded the temporal power. There is, however, another element which finds its incarnation in matter, yet transcends its transmutation and apparent destruction. That is the burning flame born of thought, which has been handed down through fleeting generations. And so where for Bose imperial power is temporal, knowledge and thought are eternal and provide the foundation upon which to build not only an independent scientific tradition, Bose argues here, but also an independent nation, because it goes on to say, we stand here today and resume work tomorrow, so that by the efforts of our lives and our unshaken faith in the future, we may all help to build the greater India yet to come. So for him, kind of that scientific call is also at that point in his life clearly a nationalist one. I hope that answers your questions.
Thank you. Since we are running out of time, I'll just take one more question. There is a big question for you, Dr. Christine. Maybe you can just pick up the second half. I think the first half is a kind of a comparison with Kafka's story. So just if you can answer the second half.
Give me 10 seconds to read it.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, the Bose Kafka comparison would be a really great talk on its own. So
I know.
My apologies that I won't be able to go into detail on that. But I think that's a great comment. And to the second part of the question, whether Bose is kind of arguing that science and imagination must exist in collaboration, very, very, very emphatically, yes, that is one of the cornerstones of Bose's own understanding and philosophy of science. And if you ever get a chance to read a couple of his speeches in particular, that is very much something that shines through, kind of that combination of imagination and science, and that you need imagination to, well, really also to imagine possibilities of science, and which kind of is a nice bridge to Dr. Parui's conclusions about literature and literature's power to kind of both remember and to imagine the future. And Bose thought about both science and literature, and that would be one of the bridges for him as well, something that literature can do, but in his understanding also that something is needed, very much needed for scientific endeavors, is that element of the imagination. So very much yes.
Thank you so much.
I'm just gonna apologize for writing down the question. I was a bit nervous, so I think if I put it all into words, I could have botched the question. So yeah.
Beautifully put. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So that brings us to the end of the session. Please join me in thanking both our speakers who have rendered wonderful, insightful talks about the topics they have deliberated on. So thank you, Dr. Christin, and thank you, Dr. Avishek. So with that, our revels now are all ended, but let's hope that we do not melt into thin air. We have our closing session coming up, so I would like to request everybody to stay with us. It's in the same room, so I will hand it over to Sarah to start the proceedings right away. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Parui and Christina. Really enjoyed. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was an absolute pleasure.
Likewise.
Thank you to our plenary speakers, Dr. Höne and Dr. Parui, and to Dr. Zaman for chairing such a stimulating and insightful session. Dear audience, this brings us to the end of the sessions for this conclave. We will